I really want to, cover your book in a not in a systemic way, but more because I don't like, kind of a scripted kind of discussion. So I kind of jump into the middle age, one of those two more characters you also mentioned about, like Isaac Newton and John Locke. John Locke is close to this America's, idea of the America's dream, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Great guy. And I was when I came to UK and I actually tried to find where he was born. I actually went to that village, John Locke's village, and then and found some of those remnants of the thing. But the more I actually try to know about this person, the more I feel detached from this guy, John Locke. I found that I've got nothing to do with this guy, because this guy has got no interest on anything to do with in the society, community, the humanity. He's got serious interest in some other stuff. It looks like he's one of those enforcer for Isaac Newton, who was the kind of chieftain for kind of snooper force, who's forging mint. That's an amazing story. Can you just explain to that story a bit more? I mean, for my audience.
Well, let's start with Locke and then go to Newton, because as you say, we are presented with Locke as the preeminent philosopher of freedom. We're presented with a Locke who is an opponent of arbitrary government and despotism. And of course, we find those passages in Locke where he's trying to stress that government must be a legitimate social power. But very often, Locke is read in a way where we miss that he is tying liberty to property in a way in which few philosophers had ever done before. And his fundamental concern with the arbitrariness of government is that it might violate the rights of the propertied, and in particular, their right to the free enjoyment of their property. Remember, of course, that the issue that ultimately triggers the Civil War in England is Charles I's attempt to impose ship money, ship taxes, without the consent of Parliament. And of course, Parliament was nothing but a congregation of wealthy landed gentlemen. And they were objecting to their wealth being taken from them for the king's military purposes without their consent. And so all of these issues of consent and legitimacy are really about government properly respecting the rights of men of property. And once we begin to read Locke in those terms, then things that legions of commentators either hushed up or said, well, these are just appalling contradictions we can't make any sense of. Now these things start to make sense, so that, I began to pick up in my research, well, if Locke was this great prophet of freedom, why was he an early investor in the Royal African Company, which was trading in slaves? Why did he co-write the Constitution of Carolina, in which slavery is legitimated, and in fact, in which Locke recommends, quote, the absolute power, unquote, of masters over their slaves? And so, for all the people who wanted Locke to be the great prophet of liberty, they had to somehow say, well, he was being inconsistent here. Unfortunately, he was a man who made errors, and so on. But what if, in fact, Locke thought this was entirely consistent? And as soon as we see property as at the heart of his philosophy, and particularly the idea that it is the liberty of the propertied, the property holders, that's really at stake, then, of course, they have the right to do whatever they want with their wealth, including apparently by human beings, because he's investing in slave trading. He is designing with his patron, Lord Ashley, who later becomes Lord Shaftesbury, he's designing a slaveholding colony in the Carolinas and so on. So I wanted to demonstrate that rather than these being outlier themes in Locke's biography and in his political thought, colonialism and slaveholding were in fact entirely central. And once we read Locke in that way, you're right. He suddenly appears not as the magnanimous voice of liberty and human freedom, but as something much more sinister. Then we link in his friendship with Isaac Newton, because Locke plays a central role in getting Newton appointed as master of the English Mint, the London Mint, where coins are produced. And while this is a little bit of a plum patronage appointment, it's meant just to provide Newton with more wealth. It was a well-paid job, and you didn't necessarily have to do that much. Newton became obsessive. He was determined to stamp out so-called counterfeiting. Now, a sidebar on counterfeiting. It had been common practice in Britain for hundreds of years that coins were soft, and you could take a file or a knife and cut just a little bit of silver, gold, or copper off a coin. And if you did this every time a coin came through your hands, you could slowly build up small amounts of silver, gold, or copper that you could sell. Okay. And loads of poor and working class people filed away a little bit on coins. Okay. And Newton ramped up the prosecution of these people. And by the way, the death penalty could be called for people involved in messing with the coinage. And yeah, he was fanatical in this regard. Isaac Newton also invested in a slave trading company, the South Sea Company. And so now we've got the greatest English scientist of his age and ostensibly the greatest English philosopher of his age, because you're talking about men who are living through the 1680s, 90s, and into the early 1700s, who are there as Britain is becoming the dominant capitalist power in the world. Britain is now has displaced Spain, it has displaced Holland, and now is waging 100 years of wars against France, in which it prevails to establish itself as the dominant imperial power and the dominant slave trading power in the world. And we discover that its leading philosopher and its leading scientist are up to their necks in all of it, in slave trading, in colonialism, in persecuting poor people who were simply trying to find a way to survive. And if you read, for instance, Locke's writings on poverty, he is for the harshest treatment of poor people. People who are begging without a permit, for instance, are to be subjected to the whip, have their children taken from them and put into pauper houses, and so on. And I think sometimes on the left, we want to be too accommodating to the protocols of mainstream scholarship. and not actually call out this fundamental meanness and this cruelty. And so part of what I'm doing in Blood and Money is I talk in these ways about a philosopher like John Locke or a scientist like Isaac Newton, is I'm trying to say, look, they were part of a particular social class and its economic and political project. And cruelty towards the poor, cruelty towards people of African descent, cruelty towards indigenous peoples, this was all part of this epochal transformation by which capitalism became a global system. And let's not shy away from saying that. It's not unscholarly if we show the evidence to also call out that this is morally reprehensible. And when we look back at these thinkers, they can be called to accounts because their practices were deeply hurtful to the people of their age.
Votre toast, je peux vous le rendre, Seigneur, Seigneur.